Thursday Lunch and Learns, but this is really a special one. I'm honored to bring my friend and colleague, Rabbi Steve Leder from Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles. His bio is so long, I don't have an hour to read it. There are so many good things to read, but I just want to say he's a trusted colleague, so well respected for his personality and his charisma and his leadership abilities. He is just a rabbi's rabbi and one of the leaders of the Reform movement and of the rabbinate, and really one of the leaders of the LA Jewish community and one of the premier rabbis in the country. In addition to running Wilshire Boulevard Temple, a synagogue that's actually larger than ours. They have 2,400 families, and they are an incredible synagogue with a school and a camp. And so Rabbi Leder is not only busy running that large temple in Los Angeles, he's also written several books. Those of you in 100 Jewish Men may remember about 15 years ago, we brought Rabbi Leder in. And Rabbi Leder is the reason why I started 100 Jewish Men here at Beth Yeshurun. When I was in rabbinical school 20 some odd years ago, Rabbi Leder came and spoke to all the rabbinical students and told us about the men's program. And I said at that time, if I ever go to a shul, I'm going to bring it. And I was able to start it thanks to him, his inspiration and his help and his guidance. And I was able to bring him here, and he spoke about his book, More Money Than God, which was a terrific book, and I highly recommend it for men and women. And he just finished his recent book, The Beauty of What Remains, How Our Greatest Fears Become Our Greatest Gift. And this is a book that is needed now more than ever as we struggle through these weeks and months of this pandemic. So I'm going to ask Rabbi Leder a series of questions, but I'm going to let him do most of the talking, and then we'll leave some time at the end to answer any of your questions. And we have a chat room, as all of you are accustomed to now, and your different experiences, whether it's here or whatever you're Zooming now, whatever you're doing. So just type your question in the chat room. We'll try to get as many questions as we can. And again, thank you for all of us for joining us. And this is being recorded. So if you enjoy it and you want to watch it again, you can rewatch it or pass it on to your friends and family for anything you want to make sure that they learn from this discussion. So Steve, it's great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And I have to just take a moment to say that I see Edie. I see you, Edie. We have some Texans at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, by the way.
Oh.
So I see Edie Dresser there, and I thought I saw Barbara Eskowitz. Did I see you, Barbara?
Barbara's sister-in-law is Cheryl, who's on
Cheryl,
religious school director.
Oh, hey, Cheryl. So I really love the Eskowitz family and the Desser family. And so great to see you. And just so you know, I know a little bit about Texas. My student pulpit when I was in rabbinical school, every month for 2 years, I went to Sherman, Texas, to be the rabbi of that little synagogue in Sherman, Denison. So I know it's nowhere near Houston, but no. I spent a fair amount of time on Highway 75 heading north from Dallas up to Sherman, Denison. So
were you in Cincinnati or Los Angeles?
I was in Cincinnati. Yeah.
I did not know you were going to Sherman. I grew up in Dallas, in north of Dallas, so I know Sherman and Denison. Yep. I didn't even realize there was a Reformed temple up there.
There were about 20 families. I don't know what there is today, but there were 20 families in a double wide, and I was the rabbi.
Yeah. That is amazing. That's interesting. That's one of the nice things about rabbinical school. Those student pulpits, you can just make all kinds of mistakes, get those rookie mistakes out of the way. Yeah. They're the nicest people.
Yeah, it's true. Very true. Yeah, very true. I have fond memories.
Oh, I'm sure. That's pretty
Thank
awesome.
you, Brian. It's really nice to be with you. I've always admired you and your work and the grace with which you seem to run such a large synagogue. You always appear to me to be entirely stress-free. And at some point, I want you to share your secret with me.
Well, we'll talk afterwards.
Okay.
But thank you for that. It is, I'm very blessed here. It's a great congregation. Like you and I are both blessed to be just vibrant communities, so many incredible people. And so it must have been I don't know if it was a shocker or maybe a little bit of surprise on your Yom Kippur sermon. I guess it was Kol Nidre, I guess, a couple of years ago. And kind of how this book came really from a sermon, I think, that you gave about death.
Yes.
What was the response to that? And tell us about that sermon.
Yeah. So what you're getting to is really the backstory of why I wrote this book. 3 years ago, my Kol Nidre sermon was, I'm sorry, my wife's printing something next to my desk if you hear that.
You know what it's like to work from home. It's okay.
Yeah. 3 years ago, my Kol Nidre sermon was about the 10 things death had taught me about life after being around so much death. I, like Brian, run very large congregation. We're about to go to 2,700 families shortly. And obviously that means that I spend a lot of time with families who are grieving the death of a loved one. And I spend a lot of time in the cemeteries. Some of you may know that Yom Kippur is actually structured almost like a Jewish Day of the Dead. It's meant to force us to contemplate our deaths. There are all these layers of symbolism on Yom Kippur, particularly Kol Nidre, that are meant to force us to think about our deaths so that we change our lives. For example, we wear white to mimic the burial shroud. We fast because the dead neither eat nor drink. We begin Kol Nidre by removing 3 Torahs from the Aron, facing forward. Those 3 Torahs represent the 3 judges in the Beit Din Shel Mala, in the heavenly tribunal before which, legend has it, we will stand to be judged. And they're standing in front of what? The now open ark. And the word for ark, I think we all know, is Aron, which is also the word for casket. So there are all these layers. And of course, the Unatana Tokef prayer, who shall live and who shall die. So the day is meant to force us to contemplate death in order to change and ennoble our lives. And the sermon was about the things I'd learned about death that had caused me to change the way I lived. So I gave that sermon 3 years ago on Kol Nidre. 1 year later to the day, I buried my father in Minneapolis after a 10-year journey through Alzheimer's. And going through that experience, not only the Alzheimer's, but the death, the grief, the mourning, made me realize that many of my previous thoughts and teachings about death were, as I say in the prologue to the book, just 1 degree shy of the deepest truth. 1 degree shy. And I wrote the book as almost an apology or as setting the record straight for the things that for 30 years I thought I knew about death that were just a little bit wrong. You know, there's a Yiddish expression that I love, which is a half-truth is a whole lie, which really is a way of saying that extra 1% of depth and insight makes all the difference between really knowing something and not really knowing something. And if you want to, Brian, I'm happy to get into those things that I readjusted in my thinking and my heart as a result of moving from Steve Leder, the rabbi, to Steve Leder, the son. A lot of the book is a field guide to death. Here's what you do, why you do it, how you do it, when you do it. But a lot of the book is also an exploration of that journey, of that tension between Steve Leder, the rabbi, and Steve Leder, the son. Steve Leder, the rabbi, and Steve Leder, the human being. And I actually think that's why the book is different than any other book on death. And I also think it's why it's being as effective as it is. I mean, why it's selling the way it is, honestly, because people can see themselves in it. So
your honesty that comes through, whether it's now or in the book, is what makes you who you are. But that's quite an admission. I mean, I think about all the experiences I have, and I know you have, helping families through funerals and being there when people are on their deathbeds. But you're saying never going through it on your own, you weren't really prepared. I mean, you going through this with your father took it to a whole new level.
That's right.
Explain more what you mean by that.
Well, there are 2 or 3 major readjustments in my mind and my heart and my soul as a result of having to move from Rabbi Steve Leder to Steve Leder, Lenny's son. The first, I would say, is my new understanding of grief. Brian, you and I, and probably everyone on this Zoom, we were all raised under the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross when it comes to death, dying, and grief. We were all raised to believe, we were all told that there are stages to grief. And that's an idea I push back on very hard in the book, because to me, saying there are stages to grief means first you will feel A, then you will feel B, then you'll feel C, then you'll feel D, and then it's over. And I am so certain now of the non-linear nature of grief. The way I put it in the book is anyone who thinks the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line does not understand grief. It is not how it works. I much prefer, a more honest metaphor of waves. I think grief is a lot like waves. They can come very close together and very powerfully at first. They do come further apart at some point. At some point, you will even have weeks, months, or a year of a very calm, beautiful sea. And nevertheless, when your back is turned, a massive rogue wave of grief can hit you and just take you down. And it doesn't take much to stimulate it. Now, to extend this metaphor further about grief, if we accept that it's more wave-like than linear, then all of us, when faced with grief, have two choices. And this is also a profound change in me. The old Steve Leder, before his father died, would stand in front of any wave of any kind, a wave of anxiety, a wave of fear, a wave of sadness, a wave of work pressure, any wave. My default setting was, I'm going to stand my ground, chest forward, face forward, and I am going to stand my ground because I am stronger than that wave. And that wave will submit to my will. Now, we all know what happens to that person sometimes. You end up thrown upside down, thrashing, slammed against the rocks, gasping for air, and alone. The other choice we have when these waves of grief come at us, or waves that are the result of any kind of terrible loss, the other position, the other way to manage that is, when you see it coming, you lie down, you let it wash over you, and you float with it. You just float with it until you can stand up again. And sometimes you can stand up in a minute, and sometimes it's a day, and sometimes it's a week. Whatever it is, you float with it. And that, to me, that is grief. And that is making peace with grief. You know, there's an old saying, you can't push a river upstream. You can't push a river upstream. You got to go with these currents. And that was a major, major shift in my thinking about grief. The second major shift for me has to do with memory. And it's a more nuanced point. And it has to do both with my father's Alzheimer's and with his death. So any of us here on this Zoom who have a loved one who has or had any kind of dementia, we know that they died twice. My father died twice. I mourned the man I knew when his brain was no longer the same and he became a different person. And then I mourned him again when we buried him. And the thing I learned about memory is that there's a duality to memory. I used to be one of those rabbis who would end every eulogy with, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, may his memory be a blessing. She'll live on in your memories. Thank God you have so many memories. I would say, I would kind of these flippant platitudes about the beauty of memory. But here's what I learned about memory as a mourner and as a son of a man who lost his memory. It's true that memory is very, very beautiful. But it is also true that it really hurts. In the book, I compare memory. I say it's like being caressed and spat on at the same time. That's memory. You know, I was very interested and moved by what the president said in his inaugural address about memory, because obviously, I think everyone knows this is a man who has suffered more loss than any human being should ever have to suffer. And he said, to heal, you have to remember, and to remember really hurts sometimes. And that's the truth. That's the truth of memory. It's not all Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Some of it is very painful. And so making peace with the duality of memory, like, yes, it's going to hurt today. It's my dad's birthday. It's going to be beautiful, and it's going to be hurt. And it's going to hurt. Knowing that, making peace with that dissonance or that dichotomous tension or that duality is a very important part of being able to live with memory going forward. So that's the next thing. Another thing I learned, which sounds so ridiculously obvious, and something you would think any rabbi who had seen so much death would already know. But sometimes I'm like anyone else. You know, I stand knee deep in a river and I'm dying of thirst because I don't really see what's around me, no matter how obvious it is. So this third thing that I learned is pretty simple and pretty important. And I think the pandemic has come to teach us this also, which is no matter how many times we say, I love you, and no matter how many times we hold and are held by the people we love, it's never enough. It's never enough. And these are some of the things that, you know, I really learned and have made some peace with as a result of the journey I have been on since my father's death.
Steve, tell me a little bit. You go into in the book. I know your relationship with your father, like no relationship is. It wasn't perfect, and you didn't grow up with probably the typical rabbi background in a way.
No.
Tell us about your background and your relationship with your father, and how you've worked to make peace with that relationship.
Yeah. So my father's one of 5 kids. I'm one of 5 kids. My father and his siblings, and they all had immigrant parents and grew up on public assistance, what today we would call welfare. A lot of people don't know that in the 1930s, the second largest subculture in America on public assistance were Jews, right behind blacks. We were the second poorest minority in America in the 30s. And of course, after the Holocaust, millions of Jews lost everything. So my dad grew up in a working class would be, I would say, what he aspired to. My grandfather owned a piece of land near their home that he would allow people to dump their garbage on. And then my dad and my uncle would pick the tin cans out of the garbage and take them to the junk dealer to get some, to make some money. And then they came up with the idea of opening their own junkyard, and it grew into something called Leder Brothers Metal. So my dad and my Uncle Mort owned a junkyard together. Not a metal recycling plant, a junkyard. It was filthy, dirty work. Most of their employees were ex-cons. It was working outside, and I grew up in Minnesota. It was working outside when it was 30 below, and it was working outside when it was 100 degrees and humid. And I worked with my dad often, every summer, and at least once or twice a week. When I was 7 years old, my job was to scrub the floors and toilets in the employee, locker room. So I grew up working extremely hard. Hard work was the only thing that mattered to my father. It was his religion. And because my parents were married at 17 and 18 and had 5 children before they were 30, they really didn't know anything about parenting. Nothing. I was never once put to bed by my parents and read a book to. Not once. Neither were any of my siblings. Nobody went hungry. there were 7 of us in a 2-bedroom house and 1 bathroom. We all got, we had a kind of militaristic situation in order to make that work. And I was afraid of my dad because he was a very tough, crude guy who often threatened violence. And that was my childhood. And he was different than other dads. I could describe it to you in a way that, if you understand, and many of you do, the 1960s will make sense. It doesn't mean anything today because there are so many incredible women athletes, softball and baseball players. But in the 1960s, when I was a little kid, girls did not play softball or Little League. And my dad was the guy on the block who threw a baseball like a girl because he knew nothing about sports. He could run a crane, he could back up a semi-trailer, but he just didn't know anything about being an American dad.
Yeah.
And that's what I grew up with. And I feared him. And this is part of my legacy. And then he gets Alzheimer's. And it's still hard to talk about.
I'm sure.
He gets Alzheimer's and he becomes vulnerable. Extremely vulnerable. And it begins to change the nature of our relationship. To give you one example, I think all of the men on this Zoom, and maybe some of the women too, will remember watching your father shave in the morning when we were little. And it just seemed like the most manly thing on earth. And I used to do that. I used to watch my dad shave because I thought it was just so manly. Never did I ever imagine that I would someday be shaving my father. And I write about this transformation in the book and the way in which the cognitive dissonance we all have for our parents can never really be resolved. Now, what I'm about to say is paradoxical, but I firmly believe it. Making peace with the fact that we all had 2 fathers and we all had 2 mothers, the one we loved and the one we feared or disliked or hated. We all had 2 fathers and 2 mothers in the same person. We all grew up with this cognitive dissonance, some more extreme than others, and they cannot be reconciled. And where I came to as a result of the Alzheimer's and the death was I realized that making peace with the fact that that cognitive dissonance cannot be resolved is the resolution. It is the resolution. And that was a very important insight and moment for me. And it enabled some very beautiful things to emerge. It's part of the reason I called the book The Beauty of What Remains. I'll give you a perfect example of why I called it The Beauty of What Remains. During the last 1.5 years of my father's life, he and I learned a new language together because he had lost the ability to speak. And we learned a new language called touch. I would sit in the nursing home with my dad for hours next to him in his wheelchair. And we would just hold hands for hours. Now, I hadn't held my father's hand since I was a little boy. And here I was just sitting, holding my dad's hand, saying nothing for hours. And it was so beautiful. I would rub his shoulders and he would sigh. I would, give him a scalp massage and he would just smile. And we learned this language of touch at the end of his life. And I'm so grateful for that. And that's again, sort of the beauty that remains when so much is taken away. There's something to be said for the taking away, because almost always when something is taken away from us, it reveals something beautiful that was hiding in plain sight.
That's one of the reasons why I love this book so much, Steve. There's so many, you speak as a rabbi and as a son, and your honesty and your experiences come through, and I think touched me even if our parents, and I think touch so many people, no matter what experiences we've been through, we've all had those relationships, whether it's with parents or siblings or grandparents, that it wasn't all blessings. It was mixed. But sometimes when you go through those type of experiences like you went through with your father, years of helping take care of him, even though he's back in Minnesota, you're in Los Angeles, were there times you didn't want to get on that plane and go back and take care? I mean, there had to be.
Many. First of all, you know better than anyone on this call what a free weekend means to a rabbi. I mean, they are extremely rare. Extremely rare. We're on the Bema Friday. We're on the Bema Saturday. We have a wedding Saturday night. We have baby namings, brisses, religious school, unveilings, funerals on Sunday. So to have a weekend off is, very rare.
Right.
And then you get on a plane. And then you go sit with your dad and he can't talk to you and doesn't really know you're there. He knows someone's there. So it's hard. And I didn't go as often as I now wish I had. I went fairly often. I tried to go at least every 2 months or so, but I do wish I had gone more. And that's something, I have to live with. And I think all of us are experiencing this because of COVID. I have an 87-year-old mother in Minneapolis. I haven't hugged my mother in a year. So we're all dealing with this now in a very difficult way. And we have to do the best we can. I call her 3 or 4 times a week. We FaceTime when she can figure it out. And we do the best we can. But it was hard. The truth of it is, it was hard to be with him when I was there. And it was hard to be away from him when I wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think we all feel the same, right? We could always do more, but we have to take some satisfaction in what we can do as long as we're making some type of effort. There's so much in this book, too, about just death in general, how we all experience it. And there's 2 points I want to bring up as I want you to explain to everyone who's joined us, because they were very powerful for me. One, you talk about how the end of our life, we end our life like we lived. If you were a funny person in life, when you're with your loved one, if that person was a funny in life, go in the hospital room and treat them like they were always treated. Don't treat them differently.
Yeah.
Explain that a little bit more.
This is a very helpful, this may be the most pragmatic thing we're going to talk about today in terms of what's helpful to everyone. So I'm sure you get calls like this, like I do. Hey, Rabbi, my best friend from college was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. They've given him 3 to 6 months. I'm flying back to New York to visit him. What do I say? What do I say? I don't know what to say. I always answer the same way, with 3 words followed by 2 words. The first 3 words are just show up. Just show up. Second 2 words, be authentic. If you walk through that door and you are authentic, everything else will unfold just as it should. I'll tell you, after all these years, 33 plus years of standing in a hospital hallway before I walk in a room, or standing on a front porch before I walk in a home, I don't know what I'm going to say. All I know is I have to walk through the door and be real. And I didn't fully understand this either until my father died. And all these people, like my funniest cousin David, walks up to me with this long, drawn face, this like Academy Award winning sad face, and whispering, "Oh, Stephen, I'm so sorry. It's so terrible." It's like, where did my cousin David go? It's not helpful. People want you to be with them in death or when they're mourning exactly who you are with them in life, because that's the only thing that assures them that the bottom isn't falling out of the world, right? They need the reassurance of what they have always known, and that you are not going to change your relationship with them. Now, the other part of your question, I think is really also very important to understand, because I get calls that go something like this. Hey, Steve, I've had a terrible relationship with my mother. This usually comes from women. Rabbi, I've had a terrible relationship with my mother most of my adult life. She was not a good mother. She's a narcissist, but she's dying. And I'm pretty sure now we're going to get closer together as she comes to the end of her life. And I look at this person and say, I hope you're right, but I wouldn't count on it, because most people die exactly the way they live. And sometimes that's really beautiful. And sometimes that's really disappointing. But I have found it to be almost always true. You know, death doesn't give anyone a new personality. That's a myth. Heinrich Heine, the German poet, had this joke about Jews. He said the Jews are like everyone else, just more so, which is a perfect joke.
Yep.
And so my experience is that death makes everyone more so. It doesn't give us a new personality. It makes us more so. So just lean into who you are and have your expectations managed if there's dysfunction. A dysfunctional family in life is going to be dysfunctional planning grandma's funeral and death. It doesn't change. You know, it just doesn't change. And a loving family in life is going to cooperate lovingly in planning a funeral for someone in their family. So that's how it goes down. And frankly, as I said earlier, you can't push a river upstream. That's the way it is. And I think knowing that going in is enormously helpful and reduces a lot of the friction and frustration.
And also reduces the expectations that you have to repair. You know, when we have a parent who's dying, don't expect to go in and repair everything that was wrong. Use the time now while they are alive to try to, if you can, to repair.
And if you can't, and often you can't, you know, there's that story in the book about the red ceramic bowl on my coffee table. So yeah. I have a couch in my office I call the couch of tears, because so many people sit there and weep on that. And so I have a red ceramic bowl on the coffee table in front of the couch. The bowl serves two purposes. First, it's to collect the tissues. But secondly, every once in a while, I have to say to someone, Brian, you see that bowl? You can talk to that bowl all day, all week, all month, all year. You can talk to that bowl for the rest of your life. You can go to therapy with that bowl. You can get books to that bowl. And that bowl is never going to become a spoon. And at a certain point, you're the fool. And it's very helpful to people. We all have some relationships in our life that are toxic and never going to be repaired. And knowing that and being able to move forward is a very, very instructive and important lesson. So I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that red ceramic bowl.
Mm-hmm. I could imagine. Absolutely. And that's so true. And there's something else I think I want to make sure everyone hears too, because I think this is so important. And I've seen this as well, which shocked me when I first started out. I expected when I would walk in and people on their last legs, they have an hour left, maybe a day left, and they're not afraid.
Right.
You talk about this in this book, and I think this is something people need to hear.
Yeah.
Explain what you mean.
I've been at the bedside of more or less about 1,000 people who have died. And by dying, I mean actively dying, you know, hours or a day, maybe two from death. And I ask every time, are you afraid? And in 33 plus years, not one person who is actively dying has ever said he or she was afraid to die. They sometimes do have fears. They're afraid their kids aren't going to be okay. They're afraid they're not going to take care of mom. They're afraid mom's not going to take care of them. They're not entirely without fear, but they are entirely without fear of their own death, because when you are really dying, death makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. The only thing I can compare it to that is even close is if you think back to the worst jet lag you have ever had in your life, like you are just a zombie, you can't move. All you want to do is crawl into bed. Doesn't matter if it's daytime, 3 a.m, noon, doesn't matter. All you want to do is crawl into bed and pull those covers up and snuggle in and go to sleep. The rabbis call death minucha nechona, perfect rest. That's death when you're really dying. And it's hard to know that unless you're in that room and you see it. Now, here's some good news for people who have anxiety about death. This is really good news for any of you on this Zoom who are worried you're going to die. I can honestly look you in the eye and say to you, if you're worried about dying, today is not your day, because worry and anxiety are for the living, okay? If you're anxious, you're worried, that's a sure sign you're not dying today. So relax. That's really true. It's a counterintuitive point that really helps.
Sure.
But I have never, ever met a person who is close to dying who has been afraid.
Yeah. And it's important to remember. I think that brings us some comfort too for those of us who've lost loved ones.
Yeah, I mean, there is a point where more is not better.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're at peace. They're
Yes.
at peace. And no doubt about it. Steve, the title of your book is and the book itself, of course, is just the perfect book, I think, to read right now during COVID. And you mentioned this a few minutes ago, that this loss we're all experiencing now, whether it's loss of life, loss of livelihood, loss of experiences, loss of being with our loved ones, loss of being in shul, it's kind of peeled it back. But there's still some beauty that remains.
Yes.
For you, maybe for your congregation, what you're seeing out there, what is some beauty that's still remaining despite this pandemic?
You know, I always say to people, if you have to go through hell, don't come out empty-handed. Because this is hell. I don't want for a moment what I'm about to say to seem dismissive of the real suffering that people are experiencing. And it's both physical and mental and emotional, and I think even metaphysical suffering. We've lost our freedom. We have lost, I think most frightening of all, our sense of invulnerability. I think we all realize now just how vulnerable we really are. It's the unatana tokef all day, every day now. We've lost the right to touch people we love. We've lost the right to have our children or grandchildren in school where they belong. We've lost money. We've lost hopes and dreams. We're all carrying so much loss now. However, what has this stripping away left behind? My Kol Nidre sermon this year was my COVID confessions, my COVID alchaids. So I'll just give you a few. I have never spent more time with my adult children than I have in this past year. Our son is living with us. We have a 31-year-old son. He's living with us. We have coffee in the morning. He's home for dinner every night. We're tight. He's laying on our bed at night watching movies with us. I mean, he hasn't laid in his mommy and daddy's bed since he was probably 10 years old. And there he is, this big hulking 31-year-old kid, like snuggled in between us with the two dogs. We cook together. We eat together. I am getting more done without wasting hours of my day on the 405 freeway or the 10 freeway, driving 45, 50 minutes, an hour to get to a meeting across town to sit in a room with 4 people I could just as easily have Zoomed with. You know, I have a whole closet upstairs full of very expensive and very uncomfortable clothes that I am not going to wear anymore. I'm done with that. Nobody cares. That's the beautiful thing about these Zooms. Look, nobody cares. I used to worry far too much about what people would think of me if I wasn't dressed like the senior rabbi of Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And guess what I learned? Nobody cares. Right? So I take walks in my neighborhood. I've rediscovered my neighborhood. I've rediscovered my neighbors. In LA, nobody knows their neighbors' names. They live next door to people for 15, 20 years, don't even know their names. That's changed. I don't know what it's like in Houston, but that's the way it is in LA. It's changed. And I think best of all, it has reminded me what a small handful of people I have in my life who really matter. And how distracted I have become. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, breakfast, lunch, dinner with people I don't really want to be with. So there are a lot of positive lessons that come, as the theologians would say, via negationis, when things are taken away by way of the negative. I'll give you a simple way to think about it that I talk about in the book. Imagine the most beautiful marble sculpture you've ever seen in your life in a museum. That sculpture began as a solid block of marble, and the sculptor chipped away, removed everything in that block of marble that was not that beautiful sculpture. The sculpture was always inside, hiding in plain sight, but so much had to be removed to reveal its beauty. And this is what I mean by the beauty of what remains. That when we have losses, it highlights the beauty of what remains. My relationship with my father is in many ways far better and far more beautiful now than it was when he was alive. He makes me laugh almost every day. He reminds me to be humble almost every day. Many times I'll be looking at someone or something and I know exactly the Yiddish word my father would say, seeing the same thing. I know exactly how he would characterize the situation. I hear a song and he's there. So, there's a lot of beauty that remains when things are taken away. And it's a good reminder. I think another really graphic and helpful example is cemeteries. Your rabbi and I, we spend a lot of time in cemeteries. I was at the cemetery 4 days last week, and I'll be there at least 2 this week and probably 3. And I'm always amazed by something at the cemetery, which is the almost complete uniformity of inscriptions on headstones. We are all unique individuals. We all lead unique lives. We all have unique stories. And yet, when our loved ones, after we die, have to distill our lives down to 15 characters per line and 4 lines total for the headstone, almost all headstones say the same thing. What do they say? Loving wife, mother, grandmother, friend. Loving husband, father, grandfather, friend. No net worth, not your kid's GPA, not your zip code, not your resume.
Not car you drive.
Not the car you drive. It all comes down. It's such a powerful exercise in essentialism of this reminder. And I think COVID has done this too, that it's who we have, not what we have, that matters.
Yeah. And that's, I was about to say that, right? This has been your book, More Money Than God, was such a good book about that. And this book now too, it's in this pandemic, it's who we have, not what we have.
Let me ask you a question, Brian, what you think about this. Do you think if this virus lacked the lethality that it has, if it was no more deadly than the flu, let's say, do you think for a minute we would have this global pause and this opportunity to reevaluate what's important and meet, therefore, who's important in our lives? Do you think the world would have slowed down the way it has?
Not at all. And it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, your sermon, and what Yom Kippur is supposed to be about, right? I mean,
Yep.
We have this holiday every year because it's supposed to remind us that death is part of life.
Yeah. And I think it's the only, this is a broad statement and maybe there's a little rabbinic hyperbole here, but I think death is the great teacher when it comes to helping us lead meaningful lives. Yeah. I really do.
Absolutely. And we've all, no matter our age and no matter who we are, and no matter what zip code we live in, we're all on an even playing field. And this pandemic has reminded us that
Yes.
we're all struggling with this in our own ways. I got one more question for you, Steve, and then I'm going to
Okay.
open it up.
Okay.
And this isn't in your book, but I think I want to learn from you as a colleague and as a friend. What's your prediction on synagogue life post-pandemic?
Yeah. I'm optimistic. I'll tell you why. And just let me prove it to you first, okay? I'm not for a moment convinced that the era of bricks and mortar Judaism is behind us. I am not at all convinced of that. So much so that we are merging with another synagogue in West Los Angeles, and we are taking on a third campus. Excuse me. We are doubling down on bricks and mortar. Why? First of all, any great synagogue has a pediatric focus. Children are the engine of any great synagogue, because anthropologists talk about this thing called the reverse transmission of culture. Most people think the elders bring the young into a tribe, but it's not true. The young bring the elders to the tribe. Those nursery school parents think they're driving their kids to the shul. They're not. The kids are driving them to the shul. So, and we've all learned the very real limitations of virtual learning for children, especially young children. It doesn't work. So if the lifeblood of synagogue life are children, then bricks and mortar will always be important, number one. Number two, I think there's going to be this tremendous pent-up demand for people to gather. I mean, what is a synagogue? A Beit Knesset, a gathering place. I personally think when this thing is behind us, it's going to be like a year-long spring break all over America. I think people are going to just go crazy, getting out and being together and traveling and eating and, celebrating.
Another roaring 20s.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's going to be really extraordinary. And I also think people are going to appreciate family gatherings more than they have in the past. We're opening a big event center for weddings and B'nai Mitzvah and other things. As soon as this is over, it's built and ready to go. So I don't think it's the end. What I do think, which is very positive, is that almost all synagogues have gotten better at online programming, and that we'll continue to have a parallel virtual opportunity for much of what we do physically. For example, I think we'll always live stream our services now going forward when we're in person. I think we'll have a robust attendance online. So I don't think bricks and mortars are going away, and I don't think the virtual experience is going away. And I think that's good. And I'll tell you one of the beautiful things in our institution, and I'm pretty sure it's true for you as well, is this was one of my COVID confessions. Our millennials who work for us, now I've been really tough on millennials in the past. They don't have a work ethic. They don't think it's important that you work at the office. They're all about platforms and digital, and then it's not real, blah, blah. Guess what? The millennials who work for Wilshire Boulevard Temple have saved our butts in this pandemic. We would be out of business without them, because this is their world and they understand it. And guess what? They were right.
Yeah.
So my first COVID al-Kheit was my apology to the millennials, including my own children. I think this has enabled a younger group of people to step up and lead in synagogues that otherwise would have been waiting 15 or 20 years for that opportunity. So I think that's very positive. So look, is it worth 500,000 dead Americans? No. But that doesn't mean it's worth less.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
No, I heard you recently say that the Jewish people in 2,000 years hasn't come up with anything better than synagogues.
Yeah.
And Jews.
Yeah, there are all these federation commissions and task forces to find out how are we going to make Jews other than the synagogue. Everybody's trying to find a better way than the synagogue. There isn't one.
Right. You're right. You're right about that. And I agree with you. I think that after this, we're going to be stronger for it, better for it. We have to be. We have to take the lessons. Like you've said many times, Stephen. I love and I've heard you say this before. You can't go through hell empty-handed. Can't come out of hell empty-handed. And
that's right.
I'm going to open it up. We've got a couple more minutes. I know we're going a little bit longer than we normally do, but I do want to open it up. If there are any questions at all, you can type it into the chat room. Let us know. Any questions at all for Rabbi Leder? Well, Steve, either you've answered every question there, or everyone's really hungry.
It's probably the latter. It's been great to be with you, and I really hope this has been helpful. And you can always reach out to me through Brian or through. I'm pretty engaged in Instagram. It's at Steve_Leder, Leder. So you should feel free to reach out to me there. And I really appreciate you spending some time with me today.
Well, Steve, I thank you. It's been an honor seeing you, a pleasure seeing you, and I hope to have you back, whether it's virtually or in person at some time in the future. Again, I can't recommend your book anymore. The Beauty of What Remains, How Our Greatest Fears Become Our Greatest Gift. I've learned a lot from it. I've enjoyed it, and I hope more of our members have a chance to read it. And for all of you that are with us, I hope you'll join us in a couple weeks. Every other week we do this. We're having Rabbi Kalman Samuels from Israel. He's talking about disability and inclusion, and he's a major advocate for the Shalva Institute in Israel as part of our Disability Inclusion Month, the month of February. So I hope everyone will join us 2 weeks from today. In the meantime, Steve, stay safe.
Thank you.
Be well, and all God's blessings. Thank you.
Thank you. Call to. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.